Welcome to the Nubiart Diary number 422 for the 25th of October 2019. This is our first podcast. What we're going to do is have a look at some of the arts reviews that we've been covering for the month of October. The first up is Live at I.U.C.C. by Horace Tapscott and the Pan-Afrikan People's Arkestra, which is out now on Soul Jazz Records. This is a reissue of the jazz pianist and composer Horace Tapscott's 1979 album, Live at I.U.C.C. It's a double CD and triple LP delight. This was recorded at the Emmanuel United Church of Christ, and with only 8 tracks, the Pan-Afrikan People's Arkestra get time to really spread out, with the tracks, some of them running up to 26 minutes. Tapscott established the Pan-Afrikan People's Arkestra in 1961 as an independent African arts organisation comprising musicians, poets, dancers and painters from the Watts area of Los Angeles. It remains influential to this day, with the likes of everyone from bass and tuba maestro Red Callender to Stanley Crouch, David Murray, Thundercat and Kamasi Washington all having passed through the ranks. Many commentators and fellow musicians felt Horace Tapscott could have had a higher profile if he had focused on his own career as part of the West Coast radical underground jazz scene, alongside the likes of Don Cherry, Ornette Coleman and Eric Dolphy. Horace Tapscott had already played with Pharoah Sanders, Elvin Jones, Archie Shepp and McCoy Tyner, but instead of living a life on the road, Tapscott sought to promote independent and radical music, which was cosmic and spiritual in scope within his local neighbourhood. What he delivered was a mix of Sun Ra Arkestra, John Coltrane and the Art Ensemble of Chicago. The Pan-Afrikan People's Arkestra was run as a musicians collective and were part of the Underground Musicians Association, which would later morph into the Union of God's Musicians and Artists Ascension, covering musicians, poets, dancers and painters. They moved in a milieu that included the local Watts Prophets poets, Jane Cortez and the Watts Writers Workshop, while nationally their cultural output fed into the wider Black Arts movement. The UGMAA building was raided in the Watts riots. Tapscott came under COINTELPRO surveillance from the police, FBI and the CIA, and he was effectively barred from playing on many recording sessions. After Tapscott's debut album For Impulse in 1969, the Pan-Afrikan People's Arkestra recorded 2 albums with the Black Panther leader, Elaine Brown. The album Seize the Time, the Black Panther Party, also featured the artwork of graphic designer Emory Douglas, who was the Panthers' Minister for Culture. The orchestra had been operating from the same 2-story building in South Los Angeles as the local chapter of the Black Panthers, and many in the orchestra were party members. During the 1970s, Tapscott continued to create music, offering workshops in local parks, community centres and churches around the Watts area. The orchestra would perform for free or an entry fee of a food donation, which was distributed to poor families. From 1976, Nimbus West offered to record the Pan-Afrikan People's Arkestra at their home in the Emmanuel United Church of Christ. Tapscott said, "I had a vision of the inside of this church and I went there and it was just like I had dreamed it." The first CD sets the template with Macrame, Future Sally's Time and Noise Suppressors, setting out a deep and spiritual tableau. Mikowski's first fifth is dedicated to the memory and genius of Eric Dolphy, who grew up in the Crenshaw area of Los Angeles and passed away at the age of 36 in 1964. Village Dance, which opens CD 2, starts with some intense percussion and is the longest track here. It is one of our favourites as the groove deepens and becomes more mesmeric as the instrumental complexity develops. It is followed by LTT, then another of our favourite tracks, the flute-heavy Desert Fairy Princess. The album closes with a supplication to lift every voice as the Pan-Afrikan People's Arkestra have truly raised our spirits and consciousness. This album is essential listening. Another album we've been checking out is Sahari by Aziza Brahim. This comes out on the 15th of November on Glitterbeat Records. The Sahrawi exile Aziza Brahim's forthcoming album is produced in Barcelona by Aziza and Amparo Sanchez. We recently caught her gig in London where she was supported by Fofula, and her voice and presence are just as captivating live as they sound here on Sahari, with her tabal drum at the heart of her sound. There have been no major moves to resolve the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara in recent times, as crises in other parts of the world take priority in the minds and manifestos of the so-called international community. Aziza Brahim's music tells of the life and longing in the refugee camps in Algeria, and exile as you seek your own homeland, miss your cultural expression, and don't know when or if you will see your family and friends again. Aziza's grandmother was a famous Sahrawi poet, while her mother was also a well-known singer, and they passed their strength and fearlessness on to her. Her voice is in that rich, engaging timbre, reminiscent of other singers who straddle the Sahara, and reminds us very much in delivery of the great Kunama singer Dahab Fatinga. The cover shows a girl in ballet dress and shoes against a backdrop of a basic desert existence, indicating that life goes on and hope endures. Everyone can dream of a better future. Brahim says of Sahari, I tried to capture the feeling of longing that my elders expressed for the land that was taken away and for their past life in their country. But I know it's not just us. There are currently 70 million forcibly displaced in the world. 26 million of them are refugees. The album opens with Quattro Proverbios, 4 sayings. In it, she says, the only one who seeks war is the one who's never known it. Then comes the title track, Sahari, the Deserts, with the lines, I will cultivate so much harmony, filling my heart with meaning. I live the hope with intensity, turning to paradise the deserts. On Hada Jail, which means this generation, Aziza proclaims, the youth has declared with conviction its pledge. Not a shred of its land will be taken away. She continues on Lamamfa, which means exile. Your house is where in exile. Every sad evening I used to go. Every trace on the way there disappeared a long time ago. While on Mujayam, the camps, she declares, the life around me is in bloom, and my heart is preparing for it too. All I want is to persist in the fight until freedom is finally found. Aziza moves on to what nightlife means in the desert on Lail, which means night. There is so much that captures the attention of the eye, but the unknown is hidden between the shadows of the night. Continuing on Masa Tufulati, which means evenings of my childhood, but not me. I remember in detail the light of every evening of my childhood and every line of my mother's hands. Then on Ardel Hope, land of love, she says, my homeland, the land of love, the cradle of my childhood, to you the longings rise that embrace the sky. On Las Hellas, the footprints, Aziza sings of humanity, its presence and spirituality. The storm will pass and erase the footprints where they left their traces marked in the sand. The album closes with Alami, dreams, cementing her life experiences, culture and vision. And she sings, in my dreams appear the same meanings than on your dreams. The title track will be released as a single on the 15th of November alongside the 10-track album. Lail is the first single from the new album and can be heard on Spotify, and there is an accompanying video on YouTube. The video for the second single, Hada Jail, is also on YouTube. The third album that we covered was Historia Natural by Los Pirañas, which is also on Glitterbeat, and that's already been released. This is the new album from the Colombian instrumental supergroup consisting of Eblis Alvarez on electric guitar and computer, Mario Galliano on bass, and Pedro Ojedo on drums and percussion. The three musicians grew up in school together in Bogota, and although they subsequently went on to join different bands, together they have a common musical palette. The sound is a blend of South American rhythms such as cumbia, champeta, tropicalia, and salsa, mixed with avant-psych rock, dub minimalism with jazzy stylings. Historia Natural is their third album since they came together 10 years ago. It's left field but very highly listenable, and the standout tracks include Quedar Bien con el Oyente, and their new single Todos Tenemos Hogar is now available on YouTube. Among the books we've been reading, the first is Telescoping Effect, Part 1 by Rasheedah Phillips, which is published by Afrofuturist Affair. We attended the recent Black Quantum Futurism exhibition at the ICA in London, which included work by Rasheedah Phillips and spanned architecture, urban regeneration, cosmology, anthropology, structural racism, economic discrimination, memory, and forgetting. The book marks the centenary of the Red Summer riots and the solar eclipse, which both occurred in May 1919, that would confirm the theory of relativity. The Telescoping Effect tells the story of Elaine Arrows-Smith, an anthropologist who, in researching her own family roots, found out that her great-great-grandmother, Lula Bell, had a role in shifting the very fabric of space-time at a time when Einstein was making his own discoveries on relativity. The link is Lula Bell's granddaughter, Shirley Ann, who left Charleston in South Carolina soon after the race riots and had been blind as long as Elaine can remember. In 2019, Elaine worked as a coordinator at Research Coordinates Group Incorporated, a company involved in event manipulation, or what we would know as fixing history. Ma Bell invented a special telescope that could see a lunar eclipse days before it actually happened, but that also meant she could foresee the Red Summer riots when hundreds of African Americans were murdered. RCG lands on these events and makes you wonder if the family connection was the real reason why they hired Elaine in the first place. The book highlights the historical role of African women in pushing forward the boundaries of science and technology. Phillips uses a range of images, whether it be photographs of telescope and camera technology, newspaper clippings and flyers, astronomical and astrological charts, and maps. It opens with a quote from John S. Mbiti, the author of the seminal text African Religion and Philosophy, in which he says, "The eclipse of the sun or moon is not simply a silent phenomenon of nature, but one that speaks to the community that observes it, often warning of an impending catastrophe." The Telescoping Effect is a fascinating, thought-provoking book that expands on the real questions and discussions we need to have and sends you down the welcoming rabbit hole of contemplating human existence and the role of history and history-making. The second book we looked at was Surge, J. Bernard, and that's published by Chatto and Windus. J. Bernard was writer in residence at the George Padmore Institute in North London, and this gave them access to a vast archive on the African presence in Britain, activism, cultural production, and the publishing industry. The centre, which has a bookshop on the ground floor, was at the epicentre of the response to the New Cross fire in January 1981. Bernard uses this history to frame their poetry collection, which tells the story of two devastating fires that had a major impact on Africans in Britain. The second being the more recent horror of the Grenfell Tower Inferno, in which at least 72 people were killed in June 2017. The New Cross massacre occurred at a birthday party in South London in which 13 African youth perished, and a 14th victim was too traumatised by what they had experienced and the loss of their friends at a later date. The cause of the fire has never been satisfactorily resolved, with some claiming it was a racist attack while others said it was caused by a dispute between adults at the party. The police, always obsessed with their fiction of African criminality, preferred the second option and used it to continue their terrorist attacks on the African community. Against this backdrop and the racist propaganda in the media, Africans organised the National Black People's Day of Action in March 1981, when over 20,000 people turned out to demand justice and protection under the law from the lawbreakers supposedly paid to uphold the law. And in the poem called Plus, J. Bernard writes, "The officer said, 'Oh, it's very common for culprits to go missing.' I said, 'My son is not a culprit, and how dare he imply it?' And one of the officers stood up by the window and looked out. He didn't want to look us full in the eye. He made it clear. He made it clear from the moment he set foot in the house, the moment he set foot, what he thought of us. They led us down to a room, and on the table there you was, no face, nothing to speak of. I said, 'This is the body where you found the clothes?' Nod. So I said, 'It must be you. This must be my son.' 36 years later, official racism, indifference, incompetence, and contempt for ordinary working class people, immigrants, and those considered racial minorities directly led to the Grenfell Tower Inferno. The residents had repeatedly reported problems with a refurbishment of the block, which undermined the structural soundness of the building and effectively turned it into a death trap. The council and its outsourced housing providers chose to use inferior materials because they felt that was all people in social housing deserved. None of those concerned with the killing, whether from the council, the housing provider, or the contractors who carried out the work, have yet been arrested, with the authorities preferring to blame the fire brigade, who had to rescue people from a devastating situation which was created by others. The police have been more active in getting long prison terms for people they consider to have defrauded the funds set up in the wake of the inferno than chasing their friends and confederates who oversaw one of the worst cases of predicted corporate manslaughter in Britain. In the poem Sentence, after Khadija Say, J. Bernard writes, "The people have taken their hands away from their eyes and have stapled their mothers and sisters to the underpass wall, their cousins and brothers and lovers to the underpass wall. Only the missing, never the dead to the underpass wall." And Khadija Say was one of the people who perished in the fire along with her mother. She was originally from Sierra Leone. J. Bernard is already the winner of the Ted Hughes Award for New Work in Poetry and has been shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best First Collection for 2019 for their work around Surge, which also included the Surge Side-Day multimedia performances. And we'll just end the review of Surge with one of the poems called Chemical. And then the wind breathes sideways. Their suit is scattered, ghosts of the now gone, dragged out of hereafter, back to tonight, back to the cold air, making its way towards a darker past, the true past, there at spirit level. So that's the two books we're reviewing for October, which was The Telescoping Effect Part 1 and Surge. And before we leave, I'd like to just add one of my poems in a section that we're calling Lyrics and Spirits. I'll give you one of my poems. This one's called Slavery. Imagine never hearing an African beat. Imagine never having felt the African heat. Imagine never having seen the African colour. Imagine never having been an African warrior. Imagine never having tasted African food. Imagine never standing where your ancestors stood. Imagine never having had your African gods, or goddesses, totems, or spirit doctors. Imagine never working your African land. Imagine never owning your African minerals. Imagine never experiencing true African love. Imagine never having an African boy or girl. Could you imagine what kind of world that would be? Luxury, misery, or slavery? This brings us to the end of the Nubiart Diary pilot podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. There will be much more to come. If you want to get in touch with us, you can contact us on Twitter at Kubara223, by email at africanquest1@hotmail.com. And if you want to send us anything in writing, or if you want to send us CDs, DVDs, or books to review, you can send that to Kubara Zamani, African Quest, PO Box 35165, London SE5 8WU. And before I go, I'll just leave you with a little aphorism. Talk sense, or it don't make sense you talk. I want to thank you for listening to the Nubiart Diary podcast and wish you all well.